This isn't exactly the comparison video that I wanted to make. I was lucky enough to get a 6800 back in November and then a 3070 in the last few weeks, and I really wanted to do an in-depth A/B comparison between the two cards, shifting back and forth as I played with new features. Unfortunately, the 6800 performed great for a few weeks, but then it slowly started artifacting and crashing more and more often to the point that now it's practically unusable. I can't run most games for even a minute, much less long enough to run benchmarks. This comparison is going to be a bit more subjective today based on my early experience with the 6800 and then what I am now seeing with the 3070. So, you know, we make lemonade when we must. All right, so I've divided this comparison into a number of categories, and the first one is just going to be raw rasterization performance. You know, how many triangles can these cards shove out and how quickly? AMD kind of wins the category in absolute numbers. In general, the AMD card can bump out 10 to 20% more frames per second given all the same settings as the 3070. There are some exceptions. Crytek games, that use the Crysis engine, those suffer on AMD, and they have for a long time. And we're talking a significant detriment, like 30%, 40% lower than what you'd expect them to be. But in general, across the board, you're looking at probably 10 to 20% better performance out of the 6800 than the 3070. And my benchmarks, again, comparing older 6800 benchmarks to newer 3070 benchmarks, they bear that out as well. Now, keep in mind that the AMD card is also 16% more expensive than the 3070. So when you start talking about frames per dollar, the discussion is quite close and maybe even tilted a little in the 3070's favor. So now if you have a budget and both of these cards fall within that budget, the 6800 is going to give you the best rasterization performance. Now, the second kind of raw performance category I'd like to discuss is the video RAM. That is objectively a win for the 6800. There is twice as much video RAM on the 6800 as there is on the 3070. It's 16 gig for AMD, 8 gig for 3070. Now, a lot of people will tell you that the 8 gig on the 3070 is enough for all 1080p games, it is enough for any 1440p game, and it's enough to get you through to your next upgrade. And broadly, that is true. For most common, popular AAA games, that is the case. However, there are absolutely games today that will use more than 8 gig of memory, of video RAM, on my 1440p ultra-wide monitor. In fact, Legion gives you a RAM estimator as you start fiddling with the graphics settings, and a regular old Ultra preset, it will use more than 8 gig. It says it will use more than 8 gig that's available in the 3070. There are other games like Kenshi, which has a massive open world and it caches a lot of assets. It will use every megabyte that the 6800 makes available to it. And it caches these world assets. So when you flip around the world going to different places, it doesn't have to reload those all from disk. It's got them in the video RAM ready to go. So it may be true that most AAA games today won't take advantage of anything more than the 8 gig that the 3070 has at 1440p or below. It is definitely not as future-proof as some may lead you to believe. In addition, the NVIDIA cards on the higher end, the 3080 and the 3090, they use a faster GDDR6X, whereas the 3070 is stuck with the same GDDR6 that the AMD is using as well. So let's talk about ray tracing, and I'm going to start off by saying something a little controversial. I don't think that ray tracing in this generation at this price point offers a decent value proposition. The AMD card performs closer to the 2000 series of NVIDIA cards, and it's slow, there's not a ton of features there. Sure, it may get better over time, but right now, today, there's not a lot to offer from a ray tracing perspective in the AMD card. So if you're interested at all in ray tracing, you're probably not going to be satisfied with either of these cards, but you definitely do not want the AMD card. So now, the 3070, better performance across the board in ray tracing, but I'd still question whether it's something that needs to factor into your purchasing decision. So ray tracing kind of comes in 3 different flavors. There's ray trace shadows, ray trace reflections, and then various forms of light and path tracing. Ray trace shadows does offer some benefit, and it's not ridiculously expensive. You can see in some scenes, mostly where shadows from a building don't necessarily match shadows from a car, or shadows from a tree are slightly different, definition and resolution than shadows from a person, that kind of thing. So, while we have gotten pretty darn good at shadows, computed shadows in games and shadow maps, that kind of thing, ray tracing does offer a visible, noticeable difference if you're paying attention to the shadows. And in something like Thief or another game that's played in the shadows, I could see where ray trace shadows would actually give you a meaningful benefit in game, and it's not super expensive. So maybe ray trace shadows could offer you something this generation. And the 6800 will do some ray trace shadows as well, so it's not completely out of the ballgame. However, ray traced reflections has been really touted, people showing a lot of pretty screenshots. In my experience, and again, this is mostly limited to the two games I'm playing now, Legion and Cyberpunk, ray traced reflections don't look much different from screen space reflections. Sure, once in a while you'll see a slightly sharper object in a reflection, or you might see a little bit more of a light source that shows up in a reflection, but they're not dramatically different, and it's definitely not worth the FPS cost of turning on those reflections. Maybe when you get to the upper tier cards, a 3080, 3090, and you have some FPS overhead to play with, maybe it makes sense to turn them on then. But for now, the very, very minor graphical boost you get from turning on reflections is definitely not worth the performance hit. And then when you move into things like path tracing, that's really kind of reserved for tech demos at this point. Minecraft RTX, Quake 2 RTX, those games are capable of doing it on today's cards, but the hardware just isn't there to do it on AAA titles or super popular games or games that simulate realism. Not gonna really see that on any of those games in a playable state on these cards. Maybe someday in the future, when the cards are so powerful that we're getting 250 frames per second on 1440p ultra wide or 4K resolutions, then maybe it makes sense to give 30-40% of that back to ray tracing. But for today, when these cards are barely pushing 60, if they are pushing 60 at ultra settings, I'm definitely not going to trade texture resolution or geometry precision to get ray traced reflections, or probably even ray traced shadows. So the solution to the ray tracing performance hit on these NVIDIA cards has been their DLSS technology. And if you read the reviews and articles and see what people are saying about DLSS, they make it sound like it's like a miracle technology. Like it's utopian, you turn the switch, you get 20% more frames per second for free, end of story. And in my experience, that's kind of true, but there's some serious caveats to it. Yes, you get a performance boost. It is rendering the scene in lower resolution in the background, which it can do much faster than using all kinds of AI and algorithmic upscaling to make it look great. And often the DLSS image will be just as, if not sharper, than the natively rendered image. It all looks great, and when you look at screenshots side by side, it's fantastic. Can't tell the difference. Sometimes DLSS even looks better. That said, in motion, DLSS does have the occasional hiccup, and it can be kind of significant in some games. Now, in Cyberpunk, I turned on DLSS and kind of never looked back. I rarely found any errors. There was some scenes that have like the police barrier, it's like an animated police barrier that's like LED dots. That would occasionally give it some hiccups. But in other games, in particular Watch Dogs Legion, there were some significant graphical anomalies. For instance, the GPS arrows that you follow around the road when you're driving somewhere, those would kind of get swimmy and washed together. Crosswalks in a distance, they're kind of lines on the road, they would kind of mesh together and moire a little bit. I saw fences that would kind of blur in and out, and that all happens because when you render at that lower resolution, some of that image data gets lost between the pixels. There's just not enough resolution to identify where the fence bars are versus what's behind them, and DLSS doesn't know what to do with it. So you end up with swimmy moire patterns or walking textures or strobing lights. So in Cyberpunk, again, the issues were minimal and rare. But in Watch Dogs Legion, in fact, I couldn't even tell you whether I have it on right now or not. I go back and forth pretty often depending on how irritating those artifacts are. Now, presumably, NVIDIA is going to keep improving on DLSS. I mean, DLSS 1 was kind of a soft, soupy mess. DLSS 2 is pretty exceptional. Maybe DLSS 2.5 or 3 is going to look fantastic, and there's no reason to think it won't run on these cards. The technology and processors are there. It's really just tweaks to the algorithm. So I think there's probably going to be bright things ahead for DLSS, which is already a pretty great technology. So that's performance and overall features. There are some comments I'd like to make on general fitment and quality of life type of issues. The first is that the AMD card will require two 8-pin PCIe connectors, and you should not use one PCIe cable, even though it may have two connectors on the end of it. You should use two independent cables running from your power supply. So keep that in mind. You will need two of those PCIe connectors and cables, whereas the NVIDIA card, they have a converter that converts one 8-pin PCIe to their proprietary little cable that goes into the side. And I actually kind of like that, because that proprietary cable, that little converter, it's small, unobtrusive, and it looks better than the big ol' honkin' 8-pin and then, possibly with other wires coming out for the second 8-pin connector. It's cleaner than the standard 8-pin connector. So I'm kind of all for that little converter. And now the larger cards have two 8-pin connectors that go into a single converter. Those are a bit more of a mess. But for the 3070, the one little cable's kind of nice. Now the second thing is that the AMD card is a bit larger, and if you watched my build video, you saw that the 6800 did kind of just barely touch the little cable hide panel thing in my LANCool 2 mesh. It wasn't pushing on it, so it wasn't a big deal, but it was just a little too big for the LANCool 2, which is not a tiny case. It's your average mid-tower case, whereas the 3070 fit into its little slot perfectly fine. It's maybe an inch skinnier than the motherboard itself, so had no problems fitting in there at all. The AMD does have the red LED, the Radeon light up logo on it. Personally, I don't really want that, and I think you can turn the LED off in the drivers if you wanted, so it's not a negative necessarily having it there. But the 3070 doesn't give you the option. There's no LED on it. It does look great from the side. It is kind of like that solid silver panel. So, it's a cool looking card, but if you wanted to theme your machine, AMD theme it, then the Radeon's your best bet. I did want to talk about drivers. AMD has historically had driver issues, and that manifests itself in certain games that don't run as well as they should, and with a major focus on productivity apps that often don't behave or perform as well as they should. I experienced none of that with this AMD card. Everything I threw at it worked exactly as I had expected. So every game, no problem. DaVinci Resolve is my editing suite of choice, no problem. I run the Affinity suite, no issues there. Everything just kind of worked with the AMD card, which was great, it was refreshing. Now I did mention that they have the problem with the Crytek games. That still persists. It's a small subset of games, but if you are into those Crysis games, then take note. On the other hand, the NVIDIA card, which was expected to be the super stable, solid drivers, they've been doing this forever, with quality situation, I did have some small problems with their drivers. In particular, DaVinci Resolve, with the drivers they released in early January, would either throw a 702 error or would fail to render in the preview windows. Now, it turns out NVIDIA has a studio driver which fixes that problem, but it doesn't contain some of the latest game optimizations and fixes. Now, in the games that I ran, I think across the board, I did not see any major performance differences. There was maybe one game, I think it might have been Legion, that did have a slight impact, but for the most part, everything ran fine with the studio drivers, so I'm sticking with the studio drivers for now. But any benchmark numbers you see are with the latest game-ready drivers, and then I reverted to the studios after the fact. So oddly, AMD kind of wins the driver round. So I also checked out VR a bit. I have an Oculus Quest 2, and one of the killer features of the Oculus Quest 2 is that while you can play the independent games on the Quest itself, you can hook it up to your PC either via link cable, or if you use virtual desktop, you can run VR games completely wirelessly, completely over Wi-Fi, with no cables attached. So I was concerned that there may be an experience difference using NVENC from over the link cable or over virtual desktop to the Oculus versus H.264 encoding from the 6800. And, you know, maybe somebody that's scraping frames could tell a difference, but personally, they seemed identical to me. There was no discernible difference between NVENC encoding on the 3070 with the link cable or the 6800. You know, it's a wash from a VR perspective. So overall, this was going to be the part where I told you, you know, how I weighed each of these categories and which card I ended up sticking with. That decision's been made for me since the 6800 just simply doesn't work anymore. If the 6800 would have operated perfectly, I don't know that I would have been able to make a solid decision. What I'm seeing in this comparison is a card with more raw power and video RAM versus a card with more software and technological advancements. The 6800 can push more FPS in a like-for-like situation, period. And even though the 8 GB of VRAM may not be a limitation on many games today, the 16 GB of VRAM in the 6800 absolutely will be utilized by games and applications in the near future. As for ray tracing, I stand by my comments that it's just not worth the cost this generation. Maybe when video cards are pushing super high frame rates at ultra settings, it may be worth sacrificing some performance for a small fidelity boost, but today, ray tracing is just not part of my decision. DLSS, on the other hand, is pretty remarkable technology, and while it's not perfect today, it is very, very impressive, and I can't wait to see what they can do with it in future iterations. At the end of the day, I guess I'm fortunate that my 6800 failed, as this would be a very difficult decision to make. Someone who is looking for the best performance in all games, not just the latest, greatest DLSS-enabled AAA titles, and doesn't want to spend time flipping switches and tweaking knobs to find the right combination of graphical fidelity and performance, may be better off with the 6800. But as for me, even if both cards were working as they should, I think I would regret not being able to witness firsthand what NVIDIA can do with DLSS. And the 3070, it doesn't perform that differently from the 6800. So that's my thoughts on the 6800 versus the 3070. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you enjoyed my other videos, please subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.